7. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. Now, of course, it's important to understand the previous context in order to understand what Paul is referring to in verse 7 as he's speaking to the Colossians. So, what Paul is referring to when it comes to the Colossians and what they once walked in, we find out in verses 5 to 6, where in verse 5, Paul says to the Colossians to put to death, therefore, what is earthly in them. And then he goes off to list the sins of sexual attitude and behavior, which are sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And then in verse 6, he allows them to understand that on account of these, the wrath of God is coming. So, where we pick up in verse 7, what Paul is referring to when he's talking about in these you two once walked, he's referring to the earthly practices that the Colossians were walking in. And I think it's worth noting that the Colossian church is made up historically of Gentiles. So it only makes sense that Paul is telling them in verse 7 that in these you two once walked. And he also goes on to say when you were living in them, meaning when they were apart from Christ, right? When that mystery of Christ wasn't revealed, but now it has been revealed. And that's why when Paul says when you were living in them, he's making clear to them that he's referring to their former manner of life. In verse 8 is where Paul brings them back to the present moment. And we know this because he says, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. And the way that we know Paul is bringing them back to the present moment and is no longer speaking of their former manner of life is due to that small phrase in verse 8, but now. So it's a clear indication to the Colossians that he's talking about now. And he tells them that now you must put them all away. And he says, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. And I love that phrase, put them all away. And the reason I love it is because it's as if Paul is tying in the sins that he listed off in verse 5, such as sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. These sins that, of course, pertain to sexual attitude and behavior, which simply just means these sins of action. And now in verse 8, Paul is